Yeah, so I think there are kind of two major issues that you're talking about there. So there's, on the one hand, I guess, greater distribution of the wealth that's currently in the system in tennis. And then the second issue is sort of how the income inequality that currently exists relates and contributes to match fixing. If we just talk about how we can try to resolve the income inequality that exists in the sport, I think just the redistribution of the wealth, let's say if we just look at the top at Grand Slams, it wouldn't really be enough because there's this targeting issue. So if you look at a number of the players that are just outside sort of the, let's call it the break-even point, so the players that are able to kind of sustain themselves by what they're making just based on their prize money earnings to cover the cost of travel, their staff, accommodation, and all of those things. There's really only about the top 150 players are able to do that. So if you look just outside of that group, those players are primarily playing on the challenger level. And, maybe they're playing one Grand Slam event a year. So even if you're to put more money into the Grand Slams, it's not clear that it's really going to go to those players that are most in need. And then you've got a ton of other players that are in the system. So if you really think about, if we consider a player that's played at least one future event during the year to be a professional player, we're talking about thousands of players. So I think there's some need to reconsider, like, well, who are we really considering a professional player these days? And really it's at that lower level where the match fixing becomes more of a concern. So I think redistribution of the money that's already in the system isn't enough without addressing, like, how are you actually going to make sure that it's directed towards those players that have the best chance of really benefiting from it. We did a little bit of research on this, and it looks like at a minimum you would need about $4 million to push, let's see, that break-even point from 150 to 250. Let's just focusing on the men's game, let's say. But that's a minimum. That's supposing that you could directly allocate those funds to the players. But because of the nature of the tours, where so much is split among many players, particularly that group we're talking about, who aren't likely to advance very deep in the higher level events, it's harder to really make much of an impact, even if you're allocating a bunch of money at those earlier rounds. So you really would need something almost like, directing it, let's say, at the players that have the highest challenger tour rankings at the year end, or even like contractual types of arrangements with players. Be a really radical change from the way that tennis goes about rewarding players. I think, like, in reality, those are kind of the only options that you would have to make a big impact. And the match fixing, I think, is really something that's at a lower level of the sport. So if you talk about, even if you move the line, of prize monies to where you have sustainable incomes for the top 200 or 300 players, that's probably still not the players that are most at risk to corruption in the sport. So in that sense, I think they're almost separate issues.
Yeah, I think you raised some really good ideas for improving tennis generally. Whether they would address match fixing specifically is tougher to say. So for instance, I'm in general in favor of uniting the sport more than it is now. I think uniting the men's and women's tours can only be a positive, can only grow the game. They're greater than the sum of their parts. And we already see that at the slams and at joint events. I'm not sure that would specifically address match fixing. And similarly with prize money, one thing that you could address, depending on how you target the money, is a related but really different problem, which is young, promising players simply not being able to afford to continue in the sport. That's the real risk. You want the overall talent pool to be as strong as possible. So there's a distinction, even if they might be at around the same level in the game and in the rankings, between a young player who's going to be rising rapidly, that could rise rapidly, and someone who's maybe already 30 and is just hanging around the game, but is not likely to break through into the top 100 or top 50. And you could improve the problem of potential young players dropping out and still have the problem of there are enough players hanging around the periphery of the game that's going to be really hard to take away the potential incentive for match fixing. So I think more on the kind of enforcement and prevention side than the incentive side is where you could really make gains. And that is going to be kind of dark arts that tennis is not going to talk about, because the more they talk about it, the more it'll be easy to defeat them. It seems like they're devoting more to it. It's difficult as outsiders to assess what it is, because naturally they won't tell us exactly what they're doing.